じゃあよろしいですか。それでは予定の時間になりましたので、黒川委員。
Yes, we'd like to have Chairman Kurokawa begin the meeting. We would like to begin the National Diet of Japan Fukushima Nuclear Accident Independent Investigation Committee meeting, the 18th meeting of our commission today. First, we're going to have some questions asked of the witness, and we have the former president and representative director, Mr. Masataka SHIMIZU, who is here from the Tokyo Electric Power Company Incorporated formerly. He was working at TEPCO as the president from 2008 June to 2011 June. During the time of the accident, he was the president and the representative director at that time dealing with the accident. And this time, we would like to ask some questions of him that have to do with the time of the accident. Before we begin our questions, if Mr. SHIMIZU would like to speak, please feel free to do so. Hello, my name is SHIMIZU. Nice to meet you all. First, I would like to apologize from the bottom of my heart. Last year, in March, at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, there was the release of radioactive substances, and there was a very serious accident that had taken place. And of course, the people of Fukushima and so many people of our society went through a lot of pain and suffering and were troubled and were very worried over the many months since. I would like to take this opportunity once again to apologize from the bottom of my heart. I am very sorry. And today, I have this opportunity to speak before you at this commission meeting. And as far as the accident and what had happened before, during, and after it, I would like to cooperate fully in order that the Commission may be able to elucidate the causes for the accident. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. SHIMIZU. Well then, today, mainly, we would like to have Mr. Nomura ask his questions, if we could ask for your cooperation. Thank you. My name is Nomura. Thank you very much. Look forward to asking you these questions. First, as far as Tokyo Electric Power Company, Inc. is concerned, there is the president and the chairman. What is the relationship between the two positions, and what sort of authorities does the president and the chairman have? As far as the duties of the chairman and the president are concerned, of course, we are both members of the board of directors, and we do, of course, have our responsibilities with regard to our operations. As far as the chairman is concerned, his responsibility mainly is to deal with other companies and organizations. And as far as the president is concerned, the president is most responsible for the administrative matters pertaining to the company. As far as this accident is concerned, after it happened, there was a situation that had arisen that was different from your usual administrative activities. As far as the responsibilities and authorities of the president and the chairperson regarding how to deal with the accident, how was that divided up? The accident, this emergency situation, had arisen, and this time it's the nuclear power plant, and we had the emergency countermeasures headquarters that was set up. And it wasn't just the nuclear power plant reactor, but there was also the disaster countermeasures headquarters, which was set up. And the president is the head of both of those headquarters. So therefore, the person responsible for the emergency situation would be the president, if you would kindly understand that that was the case. Well then, as far as this accident, and responding to that was concerned, then the president was most responsible in responding to that accident you have just stated. And as you are all well aware, on the day of the accident, the chairman and the president both were not at the Tokyo Electric Power Company headquarters. Is that correct? Yes, that is indeed correct. And as far as the president was concerned, why was it that you were not there at headquarters? If I could speak about what had transpired around that time. Before the 11th of March, I do believe it was the 9th of March and the 10th of March, the Keidanren had a meeting that was held at a local area that I was attending, and it was the executive committee meeting. And on the 11th, I was in Nara Prefecture. There was a commemorative event being held to commemorate 1,300 years of that temple, and the Federation of Electric Power Companies was also supporting them. And there was a restoration activity that was going on regarding the temple there in Nara. And at that time, I would be returning from Shikoku to Tokyo, but I needed to stop by. And I decided to participate in the temple commemorative event. And I went to the temple with the director who was in charge of Nara Prefecture. And there was also a research institute there. And a representative of that research institute was someone with whom I had met, and I was able to go and see the restoration work that was being done at the temple. Then at that time, the chairman was in China, and as far as the nuclear power plant is concerned, it's a very important facility, and the company, the two top people of that company that operates these important nuclear power plants, to not be there at the headquarters, from the point of view of the people, there must have been some very good reason as to why both of you were not there at headquarters. However, you said, as former president, you were there as a member of the Keidanren, visiting Nara and visiting the temple. And were you aware that the chairman was in China visiting for a good number of days? As far as this is concerned, the chairman's visit to China, that was something that I was aware of. As you had mentioned, Mr. Nomura, for the chairman and the president at the same time not to be there at company headquarters is not something that is ideal. And looking back, I do reflect upon this and feel this ought not have been the case. And I'm filled with regret. As far as that schedule is concerned, up until now, we tried to make most certain that we would both be there. There was an unwritten rule. As far as your plans at that time as president, you really needed to leave the company headquarters. It was that important for you not to be there. At the same time as the chairman wasn't there, there was a lot of schedule adjustment that took place beforehand, and it was very difficult to change the schedule due to the people that we were visiting. And as the Federation of Electric Power Companies and the chairman of that, your work there is separate from your work as president of the company. Yes, rather than saying separate, the Federation of Electric Power Companies, our company is a member of that. But as far as the support was concerned, that is the support work that was done at the Federation of Electric Power Companies. And at that time, you were the chairman of this Federation of Electric Power Companies as president at that time. As far as Tokyo Electric Power Company is concerned, what is the relationship between your company and this Federation of Electric Power Companies? As you are well aware, as far as this federation is concerned, there are 9, including Okinawa, 10 electric power companies, and it's an organization that has those companies as members. And there are common agenda items that are being discussed and policy that is being developed within that organization through our discussions with one another. Well, President, when you were chairman of the Federation of Electric Power Companies, as far as the severe accident response was concerned, there was legislation that was being put together to deal with that. Yes, I do recall that. As far as the putting together of that legislation is concerned, I don't have the confidence that I fully understand this as yet. But from the point of view of regulations, I do understand there was movement taking place in that regard. So it was 2010, the year before this accident took place. The Federation was very strongly against this legislation being put together, I do understand. Why is it that this Federation was resisting the actions that were being taken by the regulatory bodies? As far as the Federation is concerned, it's not just severe accidents, but as far as regulations, various regulations are concerned, as electric power companies, the current situation and the current challenges that we're grappling with, we give our opinions, and we also have our exchange of opinions with the regulatory bodies. And regarding these regulations and the pressure that we might exercise vis-a-vis the regulatory bodies or to soften their efforts, this isn't something that we do. That's my awareness.
For example, in regard to the possible enactment of measures against the severe accident, it needs to be met to fulfill what's stipulated in the regulations. Therefore, even before the disaster, countermeasures were in place for the severe accident before 3/11. But according to what we know, NISA, for example, has proposed a draft. And rather than stating some problems, it was that FEPC who has come up with its own proposal and said it is more desirable, and that's how you have negotiated. In that sense, as you have said, would you say that it's merely the response to the hearing that was conducted? Yes, that's my understanding. Now, let me ask you about the accident. We believe that if there were more countermeasures before the accidents, there could have been a possibility to prevent the accident. At least there were a number of opportunities to do so. For one, let me talk about the countermeasures against tsunami. At TEPCO, I'm sure various opinions were brought up to you as the president. Is that not true? In terms of a seismic level, that was revised in 2006, was it? The new seismic guidelines came into place, and the guidelines for the seismicity had been redrafted. And as the management, of course, without saying, we have been discussing these issues as part of the management. Having said that, basically, in regard to the seismic-related activities, which are relatively technical in considerations, it was carried out by the headquarters, who was in charge of nuclear power plants, as well as the respective divisions of TEPCO, where these were considered. And in it, if they are important issue for the management, then needless to say, it will be brought up to the management committee. you talked about the seismic countermeasures or the tsunami countermeasures, but were they discussed by the management? Do you have any recollection that discussions took place? When the seismic guidelines was drafted, yes, we did, but you are talking about time other than that? It could be now or at any time. What is the management policy that you have launched as the president? In regard to the revision of the new seismic guidelines, we have taken countermeasures to address the issue, but other than that, whether it's the earthquake and or should I say the tsunami, the discussions and considerations were not brought to me as of yet. All right. There is what's called the earthquake back check, and there was quite a bit of delay in the earthquake back check. Is that your understanding? Yes, rather than to say delay, we have lots of plants at TEPCO, and what we need to do is to analyze and evaluate each plant in terms of its seismicity. But in order to do so, it takes time to analyze. And at the same time, all the nuclear power plants are going to do the same. And depending upon the nuclear power plant, it will be quite voluminous in what needs to be done. Thus, for each and every plant, when we have come up with a schedule to reinforce the seismicity of each of the nuclear power plants. Of course, for each plant, what needs to be attained would differ from the next plant. But as you have pointed out, you said, quote, delay, unquote, but I would say that it does need time. That was our understanding. At Fukushima nuclear power plant, I take it that the seismic back check was not carried out much. Rather than to say delay, maybe I should say it was not even taken up. What was the reason for this? Well, in regard to the construction of the reinforcement, some of the plants were undergoing the reinforcement. As an example, at Fukushima number 2, the 4th unit, the reinforcement activity was underway. And if everything had gone as planned, it would have been completed by 2011. That was the schedule for the reinforcement. If so, in regard to the seismic reinforcement activities, so you knew how the budget was being spent. Is that true? Yes, as you say, that reinforcement construction is something that's going to cost a lot of money. A schedule is important, but in addition, you need to consider the expenses as well. And that's something that would be discussed at the management committee as well, so as to confirm how much cost it's going to incur. Of course, you would confirm, but it is up to the management decision whether to spend the budget or not. At TEPCO, be it the chairman and or the president, what's the decision on part of the management in regard to the execution of the budget? Is your question pertaining to execution? Yes. There is a schedule, or should I say there is a milestone being set forth, and basically the execution of the budget would be handled by each of the power plant that would be in charge of the reinforcement construction. However, there are numerous number of plants. And if you look at the execution of the overall budget for all the power plants, then it would be dealt with and was grasped by the division in charge of nuclear power plants at the head office. Did you have the understanding that there was a delay in their seismic back check? And did you instruct that it should be expedited? Well, in regard to the schedule, we did have much discussions, inclusive of myself. And as was said, it does need a lot of time, lots of analysis, and a lot of work, which is quite time-consuming. I had the understanding it should be done as soon as possible, and that was our shared understanding. What was the specific instruction you gave in order to expedite the process? What was it that the management gave as an instruction? As I have just said, I talked about the analysis, and I did say that to carry it out to the extent possible as stipulated in the law, to carry out the analysis in a speedy manner. So it was discussed, how can we expedite the analysis to be carried out? At present, as you look back, in regard to the seismic backcheck, it's not just for the earthquakes, but it could also address the natural disasters. And if you do all the check to the end, it would include measures against tsunami. And if you have the countermeasures in place, then it would mean that you would have the countermeasures against tsunami in place as well. Thus, as you look back at present, since a seismic backcheck was ordered, there was quite some time before it was launched. Don't you think that's one of the causes for this accident? I think it's very difficult, an issue to be evaluated, but there was associated phenomena to the earthquake in which, first of all, what we wanted to do is to improve the seismic nature, and having done so, we shall incorporate other measures, inclusive of measures against tsunami. In regard to the procedures, don't you think there were some mistakes or errors in the procedures themselves? Well, whether it's the countermeasures against earthquake and or tsunami at that time, I would say that I don't think there had been any. It's always the time. If there's an accident, then people come up with countermeasures against the accident. That seems to be the mentality of the people. But if you have tsunami, then you need to have countermeasures for the tsunami, and maybe the countermeasures against earthquake may be the second priority. Don't you think there's something wrong with it? Well, as I have just said, the understanding we had at that time is, of course, we need countermeasures against earthquakes as well as tsunami. They are equally important. But in terms of procedures or the priority, we didn't consider it to be too major a concern.
I'd just like to ask you some questions. After the accident had taken place, the chairman and the president were not there at headquarters. Who was it that had the ultimate responsibility regarding that? It would be the two headquarters that I had mentioned earlier. And there is a person who is substituting for the head of the headquarters in both cases. For the nuclear countermeasures headquarters, it would be Mr. Muto, who was the substitute. And as far as the emergency countermeasures headquarters was concerned, Mr. Fujimoto, who is vice president, was the person who was acting head. And so Mr. Muto was not there, and it seems as if Mr. Komori was the person who was acting in Mr. Muto's stead. And so it was Mr. Komori who was working on making certain that power could be accessed and venting activities could be done. And from Mr. Komori to the president, there has been contact made constantly. Is that correct? Yes, from the point of view of receiving contact on the 11th, I think it was after the earthquake had taken place, about 1,500 hours. I don't recall clearly, but Mr. Fujimoto contacted me. He was in charge of the emergency countermeasures headquarters. And he said that such a headquarters was set up, and that was the report that I had received. And I don't recall the exact time. From Komori as well, from the nuclear countermeasures headquarters, I also heard from him that such a headquarters had been set up. And after that, regarding the venting activities, was there not contact made with you as you were traveling? As far as Fukushima's situation at that time was concerned, Mr. Komori was the central figure who had contacted me. And as far as that vent that you had just pointed out was concerned, first, I think it was 1 a.m. or so. As far as the venting activities and the implementation of that was concerned and taking action, that was something that I was contacted about. This is the venting activity, so radioactive substances are involved. And we needed to discuss with NISA this matter. And I heard from Mr. Komori he would be going to the Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency, NISA, to talk about that. As far as venting is concerned, as you had mentioned, whether it be dry venting or wet venting, the extent would be different. But in both cases, radioactive substances would be released. And this would be a case where there would be health effects. And if there is a wrong decision made, is it the president who takes the responsibility for those decisions, or is it Mr. Komori? As far as venting is concerned, whether or not this would be done and the judgment about that, basically that would be done by the head of the power plant, because the head of the power plant itself knows the site most well. But these are radioactive substances, as you had rightly mentioned. So if there is an issue that would arise, then it is an executive issue. So therefore, I would be the person who would naturally be responsible. From that point of view, as far as Mr. Komori is concerned, he did make his inquiries to you, the president, and you returned at 9 or 10 o'clock the next day. Is that correct? Yes, I think it was probably around 9:30. If that is the case, then as far as the venting activity is concerned, there was still considerations being made within TEPCO, and you were not there. And at that time, the venting activity could not be done. It was impossible to do if the executives could not be contacted to confirm whether they could go ahead and do this. As I had mentioned, I would make my judgment as president, basically speaking, as far as whether this would be done or not. That judgment would be made by the acting head of the nuclear countermeasures headquarters. Technically speaking, I understand how the people on site would make their judgment, but the go sign would be given by the president, would it not, as you are in charge? If I am not reachable and venting needs to be done, then it would be the vice president, who is also a director. So he would take that responsibility. But this time, they were able to contact me, so I would be responsible. So therefore, they contacted you by telephone, I understand. And if they were not able to contact you, then Mr. Muto would be the acting individual. He was at the off-site center. So Mr. Komori would be the person who would have the ultimate responsibility as the executive. When I had spoken to Mr. Komori, he said that the venting activity is an important activity for the executive members. So therefore, the president needs to give the go sign. Is that a difference of opinion? Well, if contact cannot be made, and such a thing was the circumstance that they had found themselves in, then there would have been a judgment made by the managing director. And that is how the organization works. So therefore, as far as this venting activity is concerned, you did receive this contact. So when was it that you gave the go sign as president to conduct this venting activity? I think it was a little after 1 o'clock on the 12th. I had heard from Mr. Komori at that time. And the venting activity and the go-ahead regarding that, that's something that they had spoken to NISA about. And as far as the venting is concerned, I was able to confirm that that activity would be done. And so therefore, if there was an issue, then it would be the president's responsibility. Is that correct? Yes, that is correct. As far as seawater injection is concerned, how was that sorted out? As far as seawater injection was concerned, this is different from fresh water. So therefore, as far as injecting seawater is concerned, there will be a huge effect that would be sustained by the facilities as a result of that injection. But as far as this case was concerned, we needed to cool down the reactor, and that was most essential, most critical. Therefore, even if seawater injection were to be hesitated, or if there is a judgment made not to decommission the plant, let's say hypothetically, by not being able to inject water, there would be major consequences. And I do understand, looking back on this situation, how seawater injection judgment needed to be made without hesitation. And the head of the nuclear power plant at that point also made a judgment at a very early stage that if they run out of fresh water, it would be seawater. Was there consultation with you, the president, as far as the seawater injection was concerned? I think it was after I reached headquarters that seawater injection was decided. It was on the 12th. Unit 1, I think it was about 12 o'clock, around noontime. I was already there at the countermeasures headquarters, and as I had just mentioned, as far as the judgment pertaining to seawater injection was concerned, that was made at that time. As far as this judgment was made, and when the seawater was actually injected, it was after 1900 hours, so quite a lot of time had elapsed. And at that time, as management, was there any other response that you had taken vis-a-vis this matter?
At the very forefront, who shall be in charge of injection of the seawater, they were in a very difficult situation, and what is important is for them to take an action. I was at the headquarters being the head, and we were in the position to provide the support to the front line. In that sense, since the front line was faced with a difficult environment, whether it's the issue of the equipment and others, the countermeasures headquarters at the head office is to provide as much support as possible, for example, materials, equipment, and others, so that we are to provide the full-fledged support to the front line. Coming back to the seawater injection, what was the timing for your decision? When you came back to the head office, that would be the time when the fresh water would be already used up. And you knew that the fresh water would be used up because there's a certain limit as to how much fresh water is available. It's not limitless, so it's going to be out sooner or later. So rather than to wait until this fresh water is not going to be available, weren't you able to make a decision earlier before you were out of the fresh water? Well, to tell the truth, we knew that the fresh water would not be sufficient, so that the power plant had come to the decision as well as to make the preparations to inject the seawater. So there was that process before the fresh water ran out. And as I said, it was around 12 o'clock that the approval was given. When you were not at the head office till the time that you went back, were you contacted about the possibility of the injection of the seawater? Is it before I arrived at the head office? Yes. In regard to the injection of the seawater, well, I do apologize, but deviating somewhat. I came back to Tokyo via helicopter from Shinkiba, and from Shinkiba in the car, the person in charge of nuclear reported to me as to the status. And in it, needless to say, the water injection and the venting were the central topics that were reported to me to be the priority issues. But in it, I recall that I was not reported of the possibility of injecting seawater at that time. First, it was going to be the fresh water. At the early stage, you knew, and the Prime Minister's office also expected that the seawater would be injected, but they felt that the activity on part of TEPCO was somewhat slow. According to what we heard from the politicians at the Prime Minister's office, the delay in the injection of the seawater as well as the venting have resulted in distrust towards TEPCO. As the president, have you endeavored to do away with this distrust towards TEPCO? Whether it's the seawater and or the venting, I shall be repeating myself, but the people at the front line had lost power, and there was a high level of radioactive substances. In addition, the activities themselves had to be worked in shift. So the situation was quite tough at the front line, I must say. And in terms of the timeline, things have taken much time, which is the truth. But even so, we have exerted the maximum efforts. So, as I said, in it, should I say order or instruction? At that time, we were working on it, but maybe the word uneasiness is not right, but we felt some uneasiness. Before you came back to the head office, the Prime Minister had already visited the site. And what was your impression having heard about this? You mean the visit of the Prime Minister to the site? Yes. It was during the time I was not yet at the head office, and I have heard about it, and to the extent I've heard, as I have just said, the people at the plant were making the preparation to carry out the venting, and they were exerting the maximum efforts. And in that environment, the Prime Minister was to make a visit. Mr. Yoshida, the general manager, and Mr. Muto, who was the head of the headquarters, was there, and their time will be taken. So in terms of the people who were in charge of the power plant, I had the impression it's not something that's most desirable. What do you think was the cause of the visit? Didn't you think it was because of you? No, that's not my understanding. Well, the Prime Minister's office felt that since TEPCO is intentionally delaying the venting as they felt, or that TEPCO is slow in taking the countermeasures, and there were such suspicions on part of the Prime Minister's office. And what is important for you as the president is to eradicate such suspicions. If they had some suspicions, and why was it that they had the suspicion? That's something that I'm not aware of and I do not know. But whether it's the general manager of the power plant, as well as all the people at the power plant and the people at the headquarters, we gave the highest priority to take the necessary countermeasures. So whether it's the distrust, well, we were not in the situation to feel that, to be very honest. So you didn't feel that the activity of the Prime Minister's office was unnatural. Did you feel that why are they coming? Because despite the fact we are so busy, but you didn't consider why was it that the Prime Minister wanted to make the visit? You didn't feel any sense of crisis that the Prime Minister couldn't feel assured unless he saw it with his own eyes? Whether the Prime Minister's office had the sense of crisis or not, after I came back to the head office, and whilst I was taking the necessary activities, I didn't feel that. Did you confirm once you were back? And did you confirm with the Prime Minister's office? I was away, but I am back at the head office so that I shall be heading the activities. Did you inform them? I didn't make a call myself. There is a group that gets in contact with the government bodies, and usually a counterparty would be with NISA, in which we would communicate different activities. Whether we use that channel or not, I don't know, and if allowed, I would like to confirm that. So right now, as I sit here, I'm not sure whether it was reported using that channel. I wanted to talk about the issue of the withdrawal. The President has made many calls to the Prime Minister's office, haven't you? Are you talking about the 14th, the afternoon or the late afternoon of the 14th? Yes. This is something I want to come back to later on. But compared to that, immediately after the accident, you, Mr. Shimizu, as the president of TEPCO, had hardly got in touch with the Prime Minister's office. Why was that? It's not that there's any specific reason that I can cite, but once I was back at the head office, I was aware of the difficult situation. So at the headquarters, we were very busy to come up with the countermeasures, which was the highest priority. And that was the highest priority on my part as well. In regard to the nuclear energy response law, it says that the president of the power company was to get in contact with the Prime Minister's office, or was it a different system? In regard to the communication under the Nuclear Energy Response Act, I have not enough knowledge about how to position this act itself, but whilst we were doing the activities at the headquarters, I didn't feel the need as much. To the extent we understand, the Nuclear Energy Response Act says that NISA is to serve as a secretariat, so that the operator is to communicate with NISA. And as in the past, is it true to understand that TEPCO has communicated frequently, and we know that's a fact. So you felt that was sufficient? Basically, as you say, between the operator, our counterparty would be NISA, and that would be the basic channel of communication. I see, I understand. Since we did talk about the water injection, seawater injection, let me come back to that once again. This is a fact that has come a number of times, so I'd just like to confirm, or should I say, I'd like to hear your impressions at this point. Pertaining to the seawater injection, it was little after 19 o'clock that the site has launched this, and they have started the seawater as we have understood. However, the Prime Minister's office had a different thought, and probably Mr. Takeguro, gave the instruction of the temporary suspension of the injection. But at the site, there was no way that they could suspend the injection, so naturally they continued with the injection of the water. When you saw this situation, as the president of TEPCO, where did you think that the problem had lied?
Well, as far as the events were concerned, Mr. Takeguro was there at the Prime Minister's residence, and he heard from the Prime Minister about the possibility of re-criticality occurring. So therefore, there was this concern that was expressed by the Prime Minister, and how Mr. Takeguro had received this concern was a separate matter, but he was not able to dispel it. And the head of the nuclear countermeasures headquarters for the country is the Prime Minister. So without the Prime Minister's okay to continue forward with whatever action would not be something that could be considered, we had heard. And the technical people, of course, at the headquarters were making their considerations, but within a short period of time, to try to receive the acknowledgement and then to do it, this would be very important, because if it takes a lot of time, then it could not be done. So to try to receive that acknowledgement in a short period of time was very important. Then as far as that is concerned, that's something that I had affirmed. I'd like you to please consider, as far as headquarters was concerned, when you think about the general manager of the plant or the site or the people who are working on the front line in the yard on site, and their technical knowledge and what they're trying to do, utilizing that technical knowledge, for the president to say, don't do this operation, but do this other operation. Are you in the position to give that kind of instructions? Well, the facilities itself, understanding the facilities and the operation of those facilities, you do need quite a lot of technical knowledge to do that. So the headquarters for nuclear countermeasures has their own consultations that they hold, and the operations are then conducted, and the general manager of the plant, of course, is very familiar with the plant itself. So his judgment is taken into account as well. So as far as each of the operations are concerned, of course, I don't have the expert knowledge, but I do have these experts who are working on these operations, and they can do their confirmations, and the information is being shared with myself as well, so I can make my confirmation. Yes, that's usually how it's done, to support the on-site activities and to consult with them and to share the scientific knowledge between yourselves and to make the final management judgment as necessary. I understand that. But why was it that this Prime Minister's office and residence, which was far away from the on-site people, why was it that TEPCO listened to the Prime Minister's office and the Prime Minister's residence and the people assembled there, rather than the people who were on site, rather than saying TEPCO valued their thoughts over the people working on site and their thoughts? Please understand that I had the awareness that the Prime Minister could not understand the situation very clearly, and I really tried my best to make certain we can get the Prime Minister's acknowledgement in a short period of time, even if seawater injection is done. The reactor and the danger within that reactor rising dramatically all of a sudden was not something that would happen, or it would not be so dangerous for the people all of a sudden. So having heard from various people, this was something that ought not have been decided by the head of the headquarters. The on-site people felt that way, but why was it that management did not come to this conclusion? I'm going to be reiterating what I've said before. The Prime Minister himself had his own awareness, and within a short period of time, that was what we were focusing on and made our judgment. But what if the Prime Minister's judgment is clearly incorrect? Then what would have been done? As you saw, the general manager of the power plant and the people on site, their judgment should have priority over anyone else's, and this would be the matter that would be discussed. Mr. Takeguro is an expert for nuclear power, and if there is that injection that takes place, recriticality may take place. That discussion is being discussed. This is a possibility. Did you all understand that this was a possibility? This was Mr. Takeguro, who was a fellow, his awareness, but we could not receive the understanding of the Prime Minister. So to continue in the same vein, that was something we were concerned with. What were you concerned with? Prime Minister is the head of that countermeasures headquarters on a national level, but for the people of our country, this is an emergency situation. So what is the top priority is to make certain that the countermeasures are implemented. And it's not an expert, and it is not an expert that is speaking, even if it is Prime Minister. That is one of the choices that you have, not to listen to what he has to say and go with what the experts have to say. Is that not true? Mr. Nomura, I do agree with what you have to say. I will be repeating what I've said before here. In a short period of time, we wanted to make a judgment and to resume. And if there was to be a discussion over and beyond that, then we would have done that. We don't have very much time, so I'd like to move on. So I'm not talking about a timeline necessarily, but as far as Unit 2 is concerned, the situation was becoming very dire. From Mr. Madarame to the general manager, technical guidance, technical orders were given. Do you recollect this as being the case? Yes, I do recollect that. What sort of guidance, instructions were given? As far as Unit 2 was concerned, from the 14th, a very severe situation was unfolding. We really needed to lower the pressure, and venting needed to be done, and injection of water needed to be done. As far as venting was concerned, and the SR valve and assuring the safety of that pressure vessel was something that needed to be considered. How could we react to this? Not a technical matter, but we've had a TV conference to discuss these matters. So the site people said, let's make this a priority. But this was not going very quickly. It would take a lot of time, they were saying on site. So therefore, that safety valve, this is something Mr. Madarame was an expert on, so he made a suggestion pertaining to that valve, the SR valve. And as far as the on-site situation was concerned, I understood the doctor as giving the instructions as an expert. Yes. So therefore, the on-site people were thinking about different procedures, but Mr. Madarame was saying there's a different way of doing this. And having looked at the situation, the president had said, please follow Mr. Madarame's guidance. You said this to the people on site there at Fukushima Daiichi. And then what happened as a result? As far as Unit 2 and the venting activity was concerned, that's something that we were really struggling with. And it really didn't go very well. And as far as the SR valve was concerned, this was something that was opened. But as far as Mr. Madarame, following his instructions, it turned out in a way that you had not desired. Is that not true? Technically speaking, that's something I can't really address. However, as far as the power plant was concerned, they did have their technical knowledge, and they were trying to work in parallel, and the SR valve was released. So I do believe they gave their expert knowledge. In actuality, they followed those instructions, and the consequences were not really desirous. And they said, see what happened. So therefore, the people on site were trying to implement their procedures, and the president, you were valuing what the prime minister and the members at the prime minister's office and residents were saying over the on-site people's opinions. I wasn't really trying to overemphasize one over the other. I was saying that it would take some time. And as far as this SR valve was concerned, it would take some time as well. And I said that I want to support them. And I did say that. As a result, rather than the employees on site, the expert who was there with the Prime Minister, you placed higher priority on this expert's opinion. I think it's a little bit different, the nuance. The SR valve and the venting, that's something that the site was working on. So I was trying to support them in what they were trying to do. That's my awareness of the matter. I understand. Well then, as far as the determination of what would be done, technically speaking, on site, I was able to further understand that. So I'd like to now ask some different questions. As far as this withdrawal issue is concerned, there's various matters that have been discussed. I'd just like to confirm the reality. Unit 2 was in a very dire situation. And as far as that countermeasure was concerned, there was a lot of give and take, and there was a lot of tension in that give and take that had taken place to deal with this matter. And as far as this is concerned, TEPCO, withdrawal of every last member, that is for them to leave the site, including the engineers, everyone withdrawing from that site, whether there was a decision made by TEPCO that such a thing would be done or not. I'd just like to ask further questions. We have prepared some documents here that we'd like you to refer to as we ask you these questions. Would this be all right? If you could please kindly refer to this slide. Here is a copy of it that you can refer to. We're talking about the 14th today, and even before then, Unit 2 was in a very dire situation. Just a moment, please. This isn't the correct document, is it? No, this is not the document. there's another page that ought to be here that is not here. And may I please ask for your assistance, staff members?
I'm sorry. There's a missing page. I do apologize to the people in the audience, but as we are going to prepare the missing page, and we'll show it to you as soon as it's ready, but due to the limited time, allow me to go ahead. We have looked at the teleconference that was carried out with TEPCO on the 14th at 16:57 in the afternoon. Mr. Shimizu said that please give me a report of the necessary countermeasures contemplating the worst-case scenario. What do you mean by that? As was said earlier, the number 2 unit had issue with the pressures, the issue with the injection, as well as there was a water level issue within the reactor. All of those were in a tough conditions. Thus, we need to consider the scenario as what might take place, technically that is, so that we shall be able to share the necessary countermeasures to be taken. That's what it meant. At that time, what was the very worst scenario that you had in mind at that time? Well, the water level would most likely go down and the fuel rod would be exposed. So that would be the worst case scenario. The very worst case scenario, that is. For example, there could be explosion of the vessel and others can also be contemplated. So considering this and all of that, is it true to understand that you have considered a number of scenarios? I don't know whether we even considered the possibility of explosion of the PCV, but we did consider lowering of the water level so that the fuels will be exposed. That's something that we understood could happen as the worst case scenario. I understand. At around this time, things got really tough. And as the president of TEPCO, we can understand that it's the appropriate timing for you to contemplate the worst case scenario. But less than an hour thereafter, you called Dr. Muto, who was traveling away from the offsite center. What was the purpose for this call? I apologize, but I don't recall what was discussed with Mr. Muto. I apologize. Is it was Mr. Muto was at the offsite center? No, he was going to come back because it's an emergency. At the Chuetsu Oki earthquake, the technical expert should be close to the offsite center. That's where Mr. Muto was headed. But since the offsite center was not functional, and on the other hand, the number 2 unit was in a difficult situation, so Mr. Muto was on the way to come back to the head office of TEPCO, and in the midst of his travel, you were able to get in touch, and Mr. Shimizu was trying to find a location to get in touch with Mr. Muto over the phone. So there must have been something that you wanted to discuss with Mr. Muto. I do apologize whether it was something to be consulted or whether just to confirm the situation. I'm not sure. But at that point, I don't think I confirmed the situation with Muto at that time. I apologize. My memory is not that clear. I'm sure some of the memories do fade away. But 1847, the Prime Minister talked with Mr. Yoshida, GM of the power plant. And to the extent we understand, General Manager Mr. Yoshino got in touch with Mr. Hosono. It was around 16 o'clock, saying that the number 2 unit is in a very dangerous position, or very close to the dangerous position. And at 1847, there was another call with the Prime Minister's office from the site. At that time, it was the Prime Minister himself who picked up the phone and confirmed. Mr. Yoshida said that he still can do things. When the former Prime Minister was here, he has voiced it himself. This means that the call should be made to the head office, but rather there was direct communication between the Prime Minister's office and the site. How do you feel about it, Mr. Shimizu, as the president of the company? In terms of communication with the Prime Minister's office, the emergency response headquarters at the head office would be the natural counterparty to get in contact. However, when things were really serious at the site, and when there was some confusion in the communication and information exchange, in terms of communication of the information, it might have been difficult to communicate fully. So maybe that was the reason. I am in part speculating. I see. And at 1928, Mr. Komori, who is the EVP, is headed to the offsite center to replace Mr. Muto. And Mr. Komori had said that please consider the standards for the evacuation. What does it mean by standards for evacuation then? The situation at the power plant, as repeatedly said, was in a very difficult situation, and the radioactivity nearby had gone up somewhat. So that, should I say rules or should I say procedures? Well, in any case, where the rules or procedures for evacuation was needed. So that was the intent. Well, in the worst case scenario, as you have said, or the very worst scenario, it means, for example, that there shall be the total withdrawal. Is that the standard? No, I don't think so. The full withdrawal is basically what was not in our mind at all. We were responding to the situation, whether it was the injection of the water or the venting. The power plant people were busy doing these activities, and they had to do other activities that would follow. That's the situation they were placed in. Thus, whether it's evacuation or withdrawal, that was not in our mind at all. In regard to the word evacuation, as you mentioned, I think it was under the understanding that not everybody had to be there. So that was the basis. As you have said, in considering the standards for evacuation, this was underway, and Mr. Muto has instructed Mr. Hara, who was his subordinate, to come up with procedures for evacuation, which was the instruction that was provided. This is some information that came apparent in the hearing that NAIC has carried out. If the reactor comes to this situation, only this many people will remain, and the remaining people would be bussed out to whatever the destination. Is that what was to be considered? Yes, exactly. At 1955, we saw the teleconference of TEPCO, and Mr. Takahashi, who is a fellow, in the same room with you. I think he was next to you, Mr. Shimizu, but Mr. Takahashi said, Mr. Muto, what time is going to be the full withdrawal? So he had the misunderstanding. Is that true? I think so. Because there was no need for everybody to be there. That's where it started. So that myself, as well as Mr. Muto, who was the head of the headquarters, as well as Mr. Katsumata, the chairman, and Mr. Yoshida, the general manager. This was the common understanding among the people I've mentioned. Mr. Takahashi was at the emergency response center, but should I say a misunderstanding? But at this point, as for the conversation that Mr. Takahashi voiced at that time, he said everybody. So I felt my understanding is different. So at that time, I sort of cautioned him. Yes, you looked surprised, and you looked at Mr. Takahashi. Yes, I remember that in the images. And it may be, as you say, Mr. Shimizu, but at 2016, everybody is going to evacuate to the visitors' hall. That was still being voiced. That was another misunderstanding? Yes, I think so.
If that is the case, then as was just mentioned, at this point in time, the situation was quite severe. So therefore, as far as the ultimate withdrawal, this consideration was being made, and you gave instructions to do that. But who will be staying and whom will be withdrawing? And that was not something that was decided at this point. Is that correct? That's correct. Therefore, this might be mentioned later on. The situation is a very severe situation currently. If it were to continue in this manner, then it would not be everyone, but there would be a small number of people who would remain there and do their activities. And there was this consideration that was also being made. That was the awareness. As far as the plant was concerned, they were saying they wanted to have the very minimum number of people remain, and they also wanted to have the women also withdraw, and then at the very least maybe about 10 people would be staying and the other would be withdrawn. And as far as the plant's awareness was concerned, did you also have the same awareness? Yes, I was aware of that. And as you had mentioned, within this process, how many people are there at the nuclear power plant? That was being confirmed, I do recall. There were administrative people and women employees as well who were included in that. About 700 of them were still there. If there are so many people who are there, then as I have said, for those people who are not involved in the emergency activities, we're talking about Fukushima Daini here, but based on that awareness, we decided to proceed forward. 20 minutes. Mr. Takahashi had recommended this, but the final withdrawal was not confirmed. And right now we're doing our confirmation activities, and we're trying to confirm the ground situation and make our decisions. That was what he had said. And as far as the final withdrawal was concerned, what sort of thing did you imagine at that time? As I had mentioned earlier as well. First, those people who needed to respond to the emergency, they would remain. And the people other than that would go to a separate place. And that's what we meant then. That is, even if it's temporary, we will have a certain number of people remain. And that was the determination that was to be made. According to this paper you have before you, this is a crisis situation. It might not seem that way on paper, and the people who are there, they are putting their lives on the line, and they are aware that they are doing so. And so they are trying to engage themselves in this activity, putting their lives on the line. And President, you at that time felt there was no choice but for them to remain. It was a very severe situation, of course, but It was not impossible to do work. I don't think it was like that at that time. And that was the situation as far as I was aware of it. So for those people who were doing their activities, at this point there were some proposals that were given, were they not? Well, Mr. Muto had given his guidance, and we decided to create a certain form at that point. And finally, 2000 hours 22, there was water injected into the PCV, and there was a sense of relief for a moment. However, the withdrawal criteria was still not decided at this point. Is that correct? 2100 hours 22 minutes. At that point, that's correct. The procedures have not been determined as yet. Unit 2. The Unit 2 situation, everyone was working very hard together in a collective manner. So therefore, the temporary withdrawal, that needed to be decided based on the conditions there on site. And as far as the final determination was concerned, it looked as if the situation has been contained at 21 hours, 22 minutes, but that was not the case. Unit 2 will become even more severe, and venting could not be done, and the situation is becoming very, very dire. And now they find themselves in this situation. And at 3:13, there was a determination of the withdrawal procedures for those non-emergency workers. Was that decided at this point or before then? As far as the procedural document is concerned, we confirmed the records that we had. And at this time, we created the paper document. Based on your awareness as president, as far as the withdrawal was concerned, the paper was finally decided at this point. But as far as the criteria for withdrawal was concerned, before it was made into a document, there were consultations being held and determinations being made. And the president, as far as the procedures, you understood this and you made a judgment that this is how things will unfold. As far as the paper itself is concerned, within this schedule here, I have not seen it because it's a procedure. So whether it be preparing the buses, and it says members who are not dealing with the emergency situation, what sort of procedures need to be followed. I have not seen that at this point. Then, President, well, how many people would be withdrawing? That's something that you didn't have the awareness until the very end. As far as the actual number of people who will be remaining and their roles, the general manager of the nuclear power plant needed to decide that. That was my awareness. So therefore, it was the next morning when this withdrawal took place, and the general manager of the plant decided who would be the core members and who will be withdrawing. So how many people will actually be remaining? That's something that was decided by the general manager. So therefore, President, you did not know until the very end how many people will remain, and the withdrawal already started taking place. It seemed as if ultimately about 70 people remain, but you decided you would leave it up to the on-site people, and you didn't receive any contact from them about this. Whether I received contact or not, including TV conferences, I don't have a clear recollection of that. However, for 70 people remaining, I did not receive a report of that myself, personally. Outside of the TV conference, I have a feeling that they contacted you. I think it was 2 a.m. or so that Vice President Muto and General Manager Yoshida were speaking on the phone. And perhaps that was handed to you, the phone call, when you were president. Is that not the case? General Manager Yoshida, there was a phone call, but as far as the content of that telephone call was concerned, I do apologize. I don't have a clear recollection of that. In fact, rather, Muto was talking with the head of the headquarters and the general manager, Mr. Yoshida, and I think he had an exchange of words with them. I don't really have a clear recollection of that. I understand.
I understand. It seems from the result, as we look at it, the so-called the full withdrawal was not decided, as the word is used in general. Then, on the 14th, at 1836, at quite an early timing, Mr. Shimizu, you were making phone calls to different people. With very many people, I would say, that you were consulting with quite a number of people. Or it may be that the phone was connected only with a few people, but we can see you trying to make phone calls quite repeatedly. At that time, you were consulting without understanding what would be the standard used in proceeding. As you said, it's not that I was trying to get in touch based upon a certain procedure nor a standard. What took place at that time is that there was some discussion of the temporary evacuation. And at the site, the self-defense force and others were working in this very difficult environment. And even if you say some people, it seems that it would be quite certain number of group of people that we're talking about, so that whether it's the minister in charge or NAIIC, I felt that it was something that I need to communicate. That was my judgment. The DG of NAIIC is somebody I understand, because based upon the Nuclear Emergency Response Act, the head of the NAIIC is to be informed because of the system in place. So you would call Mr. Terasaka, and it seems that you were not connected. And then call the assistant of the METI minister. And probably you must have talked with Minister Kaeda at that point. Why did you make this kind of phone call, and what did you talk with Mr. Kaeda? As was said earlier, you said frequently or repeatedly. Well, there were many phones that I tried but were not connected. Now, coming back to the phone call with the Minister of METI, I did say that the Fukushima Daiichi is in a very difficult situation. And if the situation is to continue, we can consider more difficulty to pile up, so that there would become a time when we need to consider the evacuation. That's what I told him. And people talk about the full withdrawal, but whether it's a full withdrawal evacuation, those are not the words I've used. But rather, our intent was that some people would remain, and well, the premise was that some people are going to remain. So that was a basis in which we talked about possible evacuation. And that was the basis in me calling Minister Kaeda. Minister Kaeda said in your seat, had said that he understood that TEPCO has decided for the full withdrawal. Why do you think that Minister Kaeda came to that conclusion? What do you think is the cause? Well, I would say what he had in mind is different from our intent. You asked me why. What was the cause? Well, that's something beyond what I can conceive of. Immediately after, you called Mr. Terasaka, and his impression is that I wasn't really sure what Mr. Shimizu wanted to communicate to me. So it seems that there had been some issue in how you communicated to Mr. Terasaka of NISA. As I said, we are going to leave some people, which was the grand premise. And I was trying to communicate that intent of the grand principle. On part of the receiver of the information, it's difficult for me to say what was in his mind, but it would have been something very sensitive or delicate. Well, in your mind, Mr. President, in the unlikely event, in the worst case scenario, from the perspective of saving lives, didn't you have the scenario in mind that everybody had to evacuate? No, not at this point. No, not at all. What about the word evacuation? What do you think is the meaning of the word evacuation? Well, the precise meaning could differ, but I consider that on temporary basis, people are to move away from where it is dangerous. That's how I understand the word evacuation. Yes. The word is often used in the world of nuclear power plants. As a safety-related issue, the word evacuation is used, in which for the people who are at the very front, in order, should there be any possibility of irradiation, they are going to evacuate themselves into a building which is going to be safe. In that sense, they would use the word, the full withdrawal. And I can understand the word evacuation might have been used in that sense, but whether it's everybody or whether it's some people, regardless of the number of people, but on a temporary basis, it only means to be away from the dangerous places. So if you use the word evacuation, there's a possibility of being misunderstood, that everybody is going to move away from where it's dangerous. At the point that I communicate, as you said, when I use the word evacuation, we do use the word in our manual, not in the sense it was used this time, but it was going to be temporary withdrawal, no, temporary, excuse the interpreter, temporary evacuation of some. That's something I did communicate. Evacuation is a concept that's not related to how many people would remain. But if you say that use the word evacuation, you still felt that the listener would understand that some people would remain. Yes, that's true. And as it says here, Mr. Terasaka was being communicated. And to put it simply, I wasn't fully sure what Mr. Shimizu wanted to communicate to me, says Mr. Terasaka. And it can be taken that he felt that you wanted to consult with him what needs to be done. I wasn't quite sure what Mr. Shimizu wanted to do, but I didn't consider that he wanted to pull out all the operators. So it could be that the same conversation could be understood in a different way from the listener compared to the speaker. What do you think? If you write these words at a later time, they have an image, but at that point, things were very imminent, urgent, so that slight connotation in expressions could result in a mismatch of the understanding as I look back. But as I have repeated, that was not our intent. We didn't think of full withdrawal. This is something that you needed to communicate the facts in a precise manner, doing a thorough job. If you communicate in a way that a listener would have a different connotation, don't you think there was a problem in how you communicated? Between the speaker and the listener, there could be a mismatch, and it might have been that there was a mismatch in this case. As I look back, it could have been that we did actually have a mismatch. Subsequent to that, as was said earlier, at 1955 or so, and within an hour, you have called the secretary of METI minister 8 times to get in touch with the minister. Why was it that you wanted to get in touch with the minister once again?
Well, talking about in the order of things, as far as this evacuation was concerned, it was after I had contacted him after that, 1841, and then 1859, there's been about 8 different phone calls made, but these were very short conversations. So I feel that you didn't have the opportunity to talk about that. But was there something else that you needed to relay to him? As far as this is concerned, my recollection is very vague. I do apologize. One of the reasons why you were not able to contact him has to do with the aide of the METI minister did say there was a phone call from TEPCO, and he said to the aide that I have already refused that call. And then if that is the case, Mr. Edano said, I think you should take that call or make that call and speak to them again. And that was something that was mentioned. And if this is the case, then you've contacted the minister, but you were not able to get through. It's because the minister had already heard from you and there was a refusal. And if there's another phone call that follows up that first phone call, then he already refused the phone call. So how do you understand this now? As far as this is concerned, the exchange, as is written here, whether or not it was this content as is written here, I don't have the awareness and recollection of this. I understand. And here, Mr. Edano said that I've also received a phone call from TEPCO. As far as the phone call with Mr. Edano was concerned, you contacted him before this? As I had mentioned earlier, I would contact the head of NISA and the METI minister, first of all. And my recollection, whether I had contacted the chief cabinet secretary at that time, I cannot recollect whether I had done so or not. I do apologize. And as far as that is concerned, what is being indicated here, whether it was the reality or not, I'm very sorry, I don't have the recollection, to be frank. As far as we are concerned, we have looked at documents from the Prime Minister's office, and it seems around 8 o'clock, and right before that, Mr. Edano, Chief Cabinet Secretary at that time, and METI Minister, there was this discussion that was held about the complete evacuation of all of the TEPCO employees. And it seems the Prime Minister's office was understanding that TEPCO had made a request that everyone would be evacuating. So therefore, that was refused. So therefore, the next phone call was not taken for that reason. But it seems as if there's a misunderstanding that was brought about with regard to Minister Kaeda and his understanding of the situation. Do you have any awareness of that? As I had mentioned earlier, it just leave the persons who must remain to deal with the on-site situation. I do believe that I had relayed that this would be necessary, and this was the decision that was made and the guidance that was given. So therefore, I don't understand above and beyond that. So you did not say you will be leaving just a portion of the employees? I did not say all of them will be evacuating. Did you relay that a portion of your employees will be remaining there? As far as that is concerned, a portion of whether or not I had used these words or not, that's not something I'm very clear about. However, when we think about the situation then and the exchanges that took place, as far as evacuation is concerned, I did mention this, but whether a portion would be remaining, and whether I had said that, I don't have a clear recollection of that. I'm sure you're aware, during this period of time, on site, people were putting their lives on the line, and they were thinking very hard how many people need to remain. And they were, based on your instructions, trying to figure out how many people will be remaining. So they're thinking about this. And on the other hand, they need to be able to evacuate as many people as possible if they do not need to remain. And there's a lot of struggle, and they're trying to figure out how many people will remain till the very end. Is this really the right way to go about relaying this information? As I had mentioned in the beginning, including the general manager of the nuclear power plant, we would have a portion of our employees remain to deal with the situation. And that was our intention when we relayed this. So there might have been some misunderstanding that had occurred. But I had not intended for there to be such a misunderstanding. But I'm sure it depends on how one would relay this. But if you understand the feelings of the people there on site, at the very minimum, the necessary number will remain. So you needed to understand this and make the considerations necessary and relay this. Looking at this material, I do understand it as such. But at that time, to have a portion of the employees remain. And now, thereafter, we would have to consider what will happen if such and such transpired. So therefore, there will be modifications made. But this was not something that we had relayed to them at that point. On the 15th, it's a new day. And 9:20 something, it seemed as if the situation was contained. It was 9:22, but the situation became very severe. Venting could not be done, and the situation was becoming very dire. And you made another phone call to Minister Kaeda at that point. Is that correct? I do apologize. Where is it that you're referring to? Which page, please? On the 15th of March, 131. On the 15th, 131, with Minister Kaeda. You had called Minister Kaeda when the new day began. Is that correct, or is that incorrect? Well, this is something that I don't clearly recollect, I must say. As far as Minister Kaeda is concerned, how many times have you spoken with him? I think it was that time, just that time, that I had spoken to him within this timeline. Just once? Yes, I think it was just once. If that is the case, then on the 15th of March, you did not contact him. And vis-a-vis the aide of Minister Kaida. It was not Minister Kaida you spoke with, but his aide that you had spoken with. And as far as Minister Kaida's understanding was concerned, his understanding was at 1800 hours and 41 minutes. So you didn't speak to the minister at all after that once. Yes, that's my recollection. 131, I don't have a recollection of this.
It seems that there are some missing memories on your part. We were trying the facts, and lots of facts have surfaced as a result. And there's a counterparty in a conversation, so we get testimony from the counterparty before we are able to confirm what really took place. Mr. Edano came to NAIC, and he said that just before the Prime Minister, that there was a call from you, Mr. Shimizu, in regard to the withdrawal. Mr. Edano, the former Chief Cabinet Secretary, said that he only had a phone call with you once. Is that true? As for the communication with the Chief Cabinet Secretary, to be very, very honest with you, it's not in my memory. So I won't be able to say anything about what the facts were at that time. Fine. If you don't know what the facts were, then, well, to Mr. Edano, it was communicated that TEPCO has said that it was going to be a full withdrawal. And things have aggravated more and more. And if there is going to be a withdrawal, there would be no way to put a stop to further aggravation. But the president didn't respond to that, so that Mr. Edano said that Mr. Shimizu did not voice that some of the staffs would remain. You don't remember this either? No. As for what's written here, it's not in my memory. May I? We are listening to you, Mr. Shimizu, and it seems that you are explaining in the way that's easy to understand. Lots of things were happening at that time, and in the evening of the 14th, things have settled for some time, but then the issue of evacuation or the withdrawal, it's not withdrawal, but rather evacuation, was being discussed. But there were lots of frustration because the phones could not get through, as an example. It's true that the people at the site were ready to put their lives, and they were wondering how many people would be willing to remain at the site. And the top people at the site never crossed their mind that they would be leaving the site. This is something that I have confirmed with them, and they were discussing as who would remain at the site. This was the feeling on part of the site. And as the top of TEPCO at that time, how do you feel? And they felt whatever is the decision on part of the top management, we'll do what's necessary. That was the feeling on part of the site. Basically, it never crossed our mind that everybody would leave, even though that the power plant was in a very difficult situation. That was the position on part of the people at the site, and that was commonly shared as our understanding as well. But in looking at what's written here, let's hypothetically assume that if it was received as though some people at the power plants are going to run away, that would not be what I think is going to take place. And I would regret if some people even thought about that. And I would feel sorry to our staffs as well as the staffs of the affiliated companies. So I thought you would appreciate that you have that kind of staffs. But as the top management, there were lots of things that have not remained in your memory. And that's why I do hope that you would cherish the feeling of having that kind of employees and staffs with you. It's not that the higher you go, that things get worse, but the people at the site did have the determination as what they're going to do. I'm sorry for intervening. Well, the people at the site were doing their best, ready to put their life. And rather than what was in your mind, it is clear-cut and crystal clear that the people at the site had no intention whatsoever of leaving the power plant. But how it's communicated to the Prime Minister's office, it was communicated in a way that is being bashed by the public at large. I think that would be a very serious issue. It seems that did you have this feelings, the same feelings as that of the site when you were communicating with the Prime Minister's office? Well, let's put that aside for a minute. Well, the Prime Minister's office had an emergency meeting, and there was the so-called early morning meeting that was initiated by the Prime Minister. And there was a briefing before the Prime Minister was woken up. And then the politicians had the meetings, and Mr. Fuji and Mr. Matsumoto, those who were not there, were asked to come to convene the meeting. And what was in everybody's mind is that TEPCO was asking for the full withdrawal. And Prime Minister's office felt that TEPCO wanted to execute the full withdrawal, and the Prime Minister's office felt that they had to do something to put a stop. So it seems that what was being discussed at the Prime Minister's office is totally different from your intention, Mr. Shimizu. Well, at the Prime Minister's office, they have confirmed at the site. What's being said by the head office does not match with what's being said by the site, and this was being discussed, which means that the Prime Minister's office knew that the site had no intention of withdrawal, but the head office of TEPCO had spoken of withdrawal. So the Prime Minister's office had doubts as what is TEPCO's head office saying. Even if the people at the site have no intention of leaving the power plants, but in the name of saving the lives, the head office of TEPCO was going to order on a compulsory basis that everybody had to leave. And you would be called upon, Mr. Shimizu, as the president. And what was your response when you were called? Are you asking me what happened after I was asked to go to the Prime Minister's office? Prime Minister Khan said to come to the Prime Minister's office immediately, and I went. Whether it is to the Chief Cabinet Secretary, METI Minister, and the Prime Ministers, they were seated, and Prime Minister had said two things, as I recall. One is as stated here. The question was asked whether people at the power plant intend to withdraw. And as I said repeatedly, to me, I have never used the word withdrawal. I only use the word evacuation. And it rang a bell in my mind that maybe the Prime Minister's office felt that they were considering that we might have the full withdrawal. So I responded, we are not intending to have a withdrawal. Then the Prime Minister said, oh, I see. I think that's what he said, as I recall. When Prime Minister Khan was here and was serving as a witness at NAIIC, he said, I said to Mr. Shimizu, you would not be able to withdraw. And Mr. Shimizu said, I understand. That was the response by Mr. Shimizu. Mr. Shimizu had said that they would not be withdrawn, but he has not said it. When I said they won't be withdrawn, and he said, I haven't said that. And he didn't object to it, and he just said yes. Well, what is trying to get across in this conversation is that right now you say that you said to Prime Minister that we don't intend to withdraw, whereas the counterparty, Prime Minister Kan, when he was here at NAIC, had said, Prime Minister was the one who said you can't have a withdrawal, and Mr. Shimizu just responded, yes, sir. So it was not that there was a positive statement from Mr. Shimizu. Who is right in this?
As far as this is concerned, there was in the Budget Committee of the House of Councillors from April to May regarding this accident. There were questions that were being asked, and I also participated as a witness there. And as far as the Prime Minister's answer was concerned, as you had just read, that's what was said. And I said I was not considering that. And that's what I recall him having said. I was there as witness. So as far as what the Prime Minister said, I felt that he was relaying it as it was in a different committee as well. The same statement to the same effect was made, and that was my understanding. As far as we are concerned, we have looked at the records of all these committee meetings that you speak of, and on the 18th of April in 2011, it was closest to the accident period. And this was the statement that was made by Prime Minister Kan. There will not be a withdrawal. And President Shimizu said, of course, there would not be a withdrawal. And so therefore, at this point in time, Prime Minister Kan had said that from President Shimizu, there would not be a withdrawal. And recently, too, he spoke before our commission. And this was not just an acceptance, but Mr. Shimizu, the president, said that there would not be a withdrawal. Is that closer to the truth? Yes, that's what I had said. And in the committee meeting as well, I understand him saying that, and I understand it as such. It seems as if we are getting close to our allotted time, but may we please extend our session by 30 minutes? I do apologize. My questions are not being asked correctly, and I am taking more time than scheduled. And as far as the results are concerned, as far as this matter is concerned, all kinds of things are being said. But it seems, as far as this issue is concerned, there are very many lessons that need to be learned. And it seems to be that everything is converging on who said what, who didn't say what. So as far as our understanding and the arguments that we have and sorting out the arguments, I'd like to ask you some questions. As far as the reality is concerned, TEPCO and the withdrawal of all employees, as far as this matter is concerned, for them to all withdraw and to make it a situation where the control could not be done at all of the situation. That was not something that you had ever decided. That's correct. That's how we understand it. I'd like to confirm again. Then the worst case scenario that you had assumed when you were president perhaps there might be a situation that might arise where everyone must withdraw. No, at that point, I did not consider that. I'd like to ask you then, as far as the containment vessel was concerned, there would be no choice but for it to explode. I'm sure you can imagine that occurring. Perhaps 1 hour from that point in time, that might occur, and great amounts of radioactive substances would leak out. And the site might contact you, but as far as the TEPCO president was concerned, you wanted to have the employees put their lives on the line and to deal with this situation. This is a hypothetical question, so it's a very difficult question to answer. It has to do with people's lives, in fact. And because it's hypothetical, I cannot give you a conclusion. However, if the worst case scenario is imagined and what will happen if everyone withdraws, you can imagine what could happen. However, you have to understand that people's lives are online. So TEPCO, we as operators, whether we can make this judgment or not, this is a very difficult issue to make a decision about. As far as this matter is concerned, there might have been a temporary withdrawal because we could have imagined such a thing occurring. That is the worst case scenario. So this is a very difficult question you're asking. It's very difficult to answer it clearly, specifically. As you had just mentioned, in fact, well, we've been confirming since earlier, as far as President SHIMIZU is concerned, you've contacted the Prime Minister's side very many times, and you didn't understand at that point in time what could happen from that point onwards. So therefore, you were not in a position to make your own decisions and you wanted to consult with them. Is that not true? That's not the case at all. As I had mentioned since earlier, the great premise here is to make certain that our employees stay, but we're not consulting with them about that. I understand. Then, if complete withdrawal of the employees is not the case, then Prime Minister Khan, to put a stop to the complete withdrawal, he really didn't do this. Is that TEPCO's understanding? Prime Minister Khan had come to TEPCO thereafter, and including that as well. We've heard from the Prime Minister. And whether it be temporary, it was not something that would just be a withdrawal. That's our understanding. Then you didn't consider this even once. So if the Prime Minister put a stop to this withdrawal, which you didn't even consider, that's not the reality. Is that correct? Yes, I do understand it as such. Well, if that is the case, then there's been a lot of documents that we've looked through. And we've also looked at how the people on site had felt. And as far as the complete withdrawal of all employees, this was not something that was recommended by TEPCO. So at this point in time, Prime Minister Khan, having said that TEPCO had recommended a complete withdrawal and that the Prime Minister fulfilled a role to make certain this would not happen, that was not the case at all. Yes, that is my understanding. That is not the case at all. Well then, I understand. I'd like to go on to the communication issue. On the 14th, if the worst case scenario should occur, were you trying to decide how to prepare for that? Or at that point in time, were you just consulting without imagining the worst case scenario? Which period are you referring to? The 14th. Until 9:22, there were frequent phone calls that were being made from yourself to the Prime Minister's office. And at that point, the criteria for withdrawal was not something that was decided upon at TEPCO. But when you imagined the worst case scenario, Unit 2 having a very dire situation occur and great amounts of radioactive substances being released. That was not something that was discussed, but you were talking about other matters. Well, rather than scenario, within our countermeasures headquarters, we were talking about the water level going down. And we were also talking about how the level will go even further down. And there was a likelihood of that. And as far as that scenario was concerned, that was something that was assumed as a possibility.
As I have repeated myself a number of times, and I apologize, but the people at the Fukushima Daiichi, as headed by the GM, Mr. Yoshida, were ready to put their lives. So you were not sharing that kind of assumption, whether they were determined to put their lives. I knew that the situation was imminent. That's the understanding we did share. If things had been that situation, as was said earlier, at the time of the worst case scenario, the control of the site as well as saving the lives of the people, don't you think you should have consulted about these matters? It was a very imminent situation, and as I said earlier, the very fact that there were so many people at the power plants, and we started a discussion whether that was advisable or not. So I think it's slightly different from the way you phrase it. I would say at the Prime Minister's office, they felt that the first time consultation was to discuss the most critical situation in which they wanted to know, and they felt they were being consulted whether everybody is going to evacuate. Why is it that it was communicated in the way it was? I do apologize to recapitulate myself, but the grand premise in communicating with the Prime Minister's office is that some would remain. So you've talked about the worst case scenario. That's not the way we looked at it and addressed the situation. I see. On the 15th, whether it's at the Prime Minister or whether you communicated to METI Minister, you said you don't recall. Despite the fact that you've set the standards for the evacuation, you didn't communicate that to the Prime Minister's office? Whether it's the standards for evacuation, there are procedures at the power plant. So it's a document that talks about the procedures at how to evacuate at the power plant. So it is only for the people at the site as how they should act. So I didn't think of communicating about this document. Okay, then on the 14th, what were you consulting with them? That some would leave and others would evacuate. When this was decided, then don't you think there was a need to inform them before the final decision? There came a time when some had to evacuate. I think it was a little after 6 o'clock the following day. At that time, of course, we did report to them. But in regard to the process and the procedures, we didn't give a report to the Prime Minister's office. Earlier, Mr. Shimizu was asked to be at the Prime Minister's office at 4:17. And up until that time, you were not aware of the standards for the evacuation. At this point, I did not see that document yet. So you had no understanding as how many would remain, but met the Prime Minister saying that not everybody is going to evacuate from the power plant. As for how many people and what their roles are going to be, was to be decided by the general manager of TEPCO when evacuation became necessary. So at this point, it was not yet the case that the actual number of people to leave the power plants was decided. Now, the Prime Minister's office, when you said different things to the Prime Minister's office, whether they misunderstood or whether it's because of the distrust towards TEPCO head office, they understood in the way they did, different ways and different views are possible. But through Mr. Hosono, Prime Minister himself received the call. And there were a number of times that he confirmed that there shan't be full withdrawal. You were the one, no, the Prime Minister's office knew that not everybody would leave from the site, but why was it that they were confirming so many times in the way they did? There would be no way for me to say, but I don't know what to say, because the Prime Minister's office don't really believe it. Why do you think that the Prime Minister's office have lost the trust towards you after the accidents? Whether the Prime Minister's office lost the trust towards us or not is a matter of how one views this, but not limited to the Prime Minister's office. Events, whether they were communicated precisely, accurately, and timely, is an issue because there was a loss of power, there was difficulty in communication, and there were times where it was difficult to grasp the prevailing situation. As a result, information was not communicated to the Prime Minister's side on a timely basis, and that could have been one of the reasons. Well, at NAIC, Mr. Kaeda, who was the METI minister at that time, whether it was the delay in the venting or the injection of the salt water, he was saying that they have lost the trust towards TEPCO from the earlier timing. So at the earlier timing, it was the president's responsibility to have strong, trustworthy relationship with the Prime Minister's office. Yes. We have the basic communication channel as an operator with NISA, and that's the basic channel. And from NISA, they are to communicate to the Prime Minister's office. And I think that is the reasonable route of communication. But you did send Dr. Takeguro to the Prime Minister's office, and you could have tried to improve the communication using Mr. Takeguro. Mr. Takeguro is a one that's sent from TEPCO to communicate the technical issues. But I was told by him that it was difficult to communicate through the phones, and information was not passed on too well. Mr. Takeguro went back to the TEPCO head office at one point and told to the top management of TEPCO as well as to the staffs, and has given his evaluation. What did he say? What did he say? I was not there myself. I wouldn't be able to provide a comment. Mr. Takeguro had commented about the Prime Minister's office and that Prime Minister is very irritated. And he also said that he looks somewhat childish. Should there have been these statements from Mr. Takegura, how would you have felt, Mr. Shimizu? Well, it was not that I met the person at that time, so I wouldn't want to make a comment. It seems that there was much distrust towards TEPCO from the side of the Prime Minister's office. And TEPCO also had deminimized the evaluation towards the Prime Minister's office on the other. And maybe that could have been the reason for not necessarily the best possible communication. That's my impression.
As far as this withdrawal issue is concerned, I do believe that it is an even larger issue. The Prime Minister's side talked to Mr. Yoshida and was able to understand that not everyone will be withdrawing. And why was it that this was being discussed to the extent that it was? It seems as if there was maybe a concern that TEPCO head office might be telling them to completely withdraw, or because there was a different decision that might be made, and the situation might become even more dire, and radioactive substances might be released, and what sort of response needs to be put together. If it is a company issue, then there was miscommunication that had occurred. And you were saying, not just on site, but on the head office side as well, you've never considered complete withdrawal. Then why was it that this was such a major issue at that time? In your statement as well, I think we have the common understanding. There was a hotline that was set up directly with the Prime Minister's side, and the direct orders would be followed, and this sort of situation had arisen rather than acting under the Nuclear Emergency Response Act. I do believe it's exactly as you said. And this sort of situation arising, there was an issue regarding that. But as was mentioned earlier, as far as the technical matter of controlling the reactor, injecting seawater, or following the procedures for Unit 2, the intentions and the recommendations of the on-site people were ignored, and you followed the Prime Minister's directions. As far as the seawater injection and the interruption of that is concerned, the general manager of the nuclear power plant would be making that decision, but Mr. Takegura, of course, made his decisions, and in a short period of time, we decided that we would approve that. So therefore, as far as what you're saying, Mr. Nomura, communication was not something that was completely adequate. In fact, it was insufficient, we must admit. Let's say, for example, if the Prime Minister's side said the head office has not recommended a complete withdrawal, then how we would respond in terms of an emergency arising. We wanted to have the Prime Minister's side put together their conclusions, and if that is the discussion that was held, this was not decided, but perhaps it needed to be decided. I'm not in the position to appraise that. As I had mentioned earlier, it was a very urgent situation. What needed to be done? We can only think about it in assumptions. How can we appraise the situation and what needs to be done vis-a-vis the situation? Rules, procedures, and way of doing things. There is a difficulty sometimes to do things according to those. TEPCO did not see that worst-case scenario happening. So therefore, TEPCO finds itself in this position today where you have not decided what needs to be done. You're still in that position at TEPCO. However, as far as the decision that was made, that was Prime Minister Kan who had made a decision. No matter what happens, he made a decision saying that there would not be a complete withdrawal of the employees. And when he went to the head office of TEPCO, he made a statement to that effect. Did you receive this as a correct statement? When Prime Minister Kan came to TEPCO's emergency countermeasures headquarters and had his conversation with us and made his statements, the way we received it, we felt that he was very strong in the words he used. If there is withdrawal, then TEPCO will 100% collapse as a company. And for those executives who are over 60 years old, they need to go to the site and put their lives on the line. I do recall he had said that as well. Mr. Nomura, I don't understand it, that such criteria was set up, but as far as what the Prime Minister had said, I do understand those were the words that he had said. And the impression that I had received, if I'm to share that with you, having heard what he had to say, was that he used very harsh words and talked to us all. And especially for those employees who were putting their lives on the line and working on site, so many of them, not only TEPCO people, but the affiliated company people, Fukushima Daiichi, Fukushima Daini, and Kashiwazaki Kariwa people, for these people on site, they might get a feeling that they're really being somehow attacked and devastated as a result of that. I understand your impression, but Prime Minister Kan had come and said, after he spoke very harshly, he went to a different room and spoke to the chairman and the president and Mr. Muto. And Prime Minister Kan had given further instructions, and there were further preparations that were being made. We've looked at the video, and there were all kinds of technical preparations being made to make certain that video conferences could be made. What happened then? Prime Minister Kan and ourselves, we were in that small meeting room, and there was a report we were receiving regarding the current situation at that time. Unit 2. There was an explosion that was heard, and there was quite a lot of vibration that was felt. And it was a very urgent situation that had arisen as a result of that. And as far as the nuclear power plant and the situation there was concerned, in the meeting room we were at, there was a common TV conference system that was set up, so we were able to see that very urgent situation on site. And we went immediately to the emergency response headquarters, and we decided to carry out our response. So therefore, Unit 4's hydrogen explosion and Unit 2's loud explosion sound was at the same time. Unit 4 explosion, that's what it was, and we found that out at that point. There is also another sound at Unit 2, but at the very least, Unit 4, there was a hydrogen explosion that had taken place, so it's a very urgent situation. And at that point in time, you were providing encouragement to the people on site. Mr. Yoshida is there in the video, and the others who were working very hard, they were listening to what Prime Minister Kan had to say. They were dealing with the situation. There was this loud sound that they heard, so they put their helmets on right away, and they immediately moved toward the area that they need to move toward. And for matters that were not considered, if the Prime Minister continues to speak about these matters, perhaps that was not necessary for him to do so. Do you think so?
Whether it was unnecessary or not, what is more important is that in regard to the withdrawal, as has been said, I went to the Prime Minister's residence and said it was not a withdrawal and there won't be a withdrawal. I thought Prime Minister understood that TEPCO does not intend to withdraw. So at the emergency counter headquarters of TEPCO, I felt uneasy when Prime Minister voiced what he did. That's what all the people from TEPCO would say. But if we look at the root cause, there are reasons on part of you, Mr. President. The way you communicated was not the most appropriate, and as you have rightly said, if you had said to Prime Minister Kan, and you thought that he understood, but he didn't. So you need to have had a better communication with the Prime Minister. And because you didn't, Prime Minister himself gave his talk despite the urgent environment. And the people at the site had no choice but to watch the TV for some time. That was brought forth because there was an issue in which how TEPCO has communicated to the Prime Minister's side. Isn't that how you feel? This is linked to what's been said for some time. Our intention was, without doubt, that some people would remain, without doubt. And that was the intent as we communicated. It seems that there is some misunderstanding between what we said and what was understood by the receiving side. So maybe there had been room to better communicate if I look back. I see. In regard to the full withdrawal, we would like to further give you a position. Prime Minister said that no full withdrawal would be allowed because it is only the operators who are in the position to be able to control the reactor at the very end. And despite that, the government, rather than the operator, would say and provide their advice that our advice is better. Or at times, the government or the Prime Minister might go to the site and speak as though they are going to be engaged in an activity to control the reactor together with the operator, which is somewhat confusing. If there is room for the operator to have the withdrawal, then you need to send somebody else to replace the operators. But the Prime Minister's side felt that they have no choice but to ask the operators to tend to the reactors till the very end. It's not that I had such a precise understanding myself, but the logic is, as you say, unless there is a group to replace the people at TEPCO at the site, there won't be withdrawal. you are right. So at the very end, if you're going to leave the matter in the hands of the people at the site, the Prime Minister's side should not direct. For example, there should be venting or injection of the water. Do you agree? The people who understand the site the most, the actual situation, the facilities, would be the general manager of the power plant and other staffs at the general power plant. And they should be the one to take the necessary action. That's the very basics. But having said that, depending upon the situation, there could be some technical advice or there could be some support, which are both indispensable. Thus, whether it's at the head office of TEPCO or the expert from the government side, support is something that is needed. Of course, there will be support from those who have the expertise. That's good. But as you said earlier, based upon the Nuclear Energy Response Act, since the head of the emergency response headquarters has said something, you feel that you need to give due regard. Thus, in terms of priority, there are a number of events, but there was something that the people at the site wanted to do so. But you had to do something different because you had to give due regards to the wishes on part of the Prime Minister's side. Don't you think that's dangerous? It would depend upon what event, but basically, it is not something that's desirable. Last question. If you look at the examples overseas, I would say it's true for all the cases, but they would have a place within the site, like a shelter, which is more appropriate for evacuation. And such evacuation shelters are available at the nuclear power plants. Should there be such evacuation shelter, whether you need to relocate to Daini or not, it could have been that you didn't have to sway your decision too much. And for those who are going to put their lives, even if they are going to do so, the maximum possible countermeasures to save their lives should have been placed. Don't you think that was lacking or was not sufficient? Rather than to say it was not sufficient, the situation was urgent, and we need to consider a difficult situation and to have a shelter in place. We were not ready to think about that. One of the lessons learned from this is that there would be important base isolation building at the power plant, in which at the time of Chuetsu earthquake, Kashiwazaki Kariya power plants were partially impaired. And they have built a shelter like that. And even if the level of radiation is high, inside the building is protected. And if that had not been in place, I wouldn't even want to think about it. But as for the shelter tantamount to what was there as a safety measure, I think it is one of the things to be considered, probably, but I think we would like to give more thoughts. In a severe accident, what are the countermeasures you need to consider against that? Accident management. What about severe accident? Severe accident countermeasures may be the word to be used, but for these severe accident measures, for the government body who was going to implement this, which organization was negotiating, voicing their opposition? I don't understand that the organization was opposing this. As you've said at the outset, maybe you are referring to the Federation of Electric Power Companies, but it's important. and an important challenge that we need to be able to address the severe accidents. And we had no intention of putting pressures or to make it not what it should be. But I think there was awareness on part of the government who wanted to strengthen the measures, and the Safety Commission wanted to have more severe accident countermeasures in place, and NISA was about to consider these measures to be implemented. However, the group of the operators, the Federation of Electric Power Companies, has said that this would impose excessive expenditures, so that they wanted the measures to be more lenient, and they have taken action so that more lenient measures would be adopted. Do you think this is the right approach to the negotiation as the management? I don't think we intended to have lenient measures because we were afraid of the excessive investment. But rather, what's important is that you need to look at the facilities in place before you consider what safety measures would need to be introduced. And that was the perspective that the Federation of Electric Power Companies were exchanging opinions with the government body. And I think it's important to have such a dialogue.
As far as this sort of situation not having been assumed, but in the future, there might be other considerations made for the provisioning of shelters or areas where the employees would be able to withdraw or evacuate to. And as far as the representative of that electric power company is concerned, putting aside whether it was your judgment or not, that the Federation of Electric Power Companies was very much in opposition to this legislation that was put together. How do you feel about this, President Shimizu? This will be a repeat of what I had said. I don't think that I have the awareness that we were resisting the legislation that was put together. In fact, we were looking into we were not looking into deregulation either, or easing of the regulations. That was not our awareness. Earlier, Prime Minister Khan went to the TEPCO head office and had spoken to the employees, and he said many people who were working on site were very pained. The severe accident countermeasures would have been countermeasures to protect the lives of those people putting their lives on the line. Perhaps there could have been more consideration paid to these, and in doing so, they would be able to escape from that very severe situation, and they would be able to somehow control the reactor at the same time. Even if you say you were thinking about the people on site, it seems to us that you are taking them very lightly, the people on the site, putting their lives on the line. For those people working at the nuclear power plant and making light of their situation, predicament, we're not doing that at all. Of course, this has to do with persons and their lives, and there need to be protective countermeasures. Of course, this is a very important point. You also talked about the provisioning of shelters. And that type of response is not something that I'm fully aware of what's being considered right now, but to respect people's lives and to come up with the policy that will assure their safety and assure their health. We have to think about this based upon our experience and come up with the necessary facilities and come up with the necessary countermeasures to provide for this. if you can't protect the lives of the people who are working on site, you really can't protect the lives of the residents in the area. Theoretically, this is correct. So therefore, you have to show the posture where you're thinking seriously about the lives of your employees on the front line. And at the same time, you can think seriously about the lives of the residents of this area. So therefore, look back to the past and come up with the countermeasures necessary to make certain that happens. And with regard to the confusion pertaining to the withdrawal matter, this is something we're going to be discussing further amongst ourselves and the Commission and coming up with our conclusions. So no one was thinking about the withdrawal, complete withdrawal of employees from the nuclear power plant. If that is the case, then it's not because we believe your statement, Mr. President, but because the people on site had this willingness and desire to remain on the site. So therefore, we need to think most important, the people who are working on site, on the front lines, and come up with the necessary policy. It seems our time has come. I'm sure there are very many questions that still need to be asked. However, we have reached our time limit. As far as this session is concerned, this will be recorded for posterity. President Shimizu said that this needed to be done. You understand, but it was not done. And this brings into question whether TEPCO, as this great electric power company, needed to consider this. The eyes of the world are upon you, and they are appraising your situation. Please understand that the trust that is placed in your company is shaken as a result of this. Our time has come. Thank you very much for your cooperation today, Mr. Shimizu. It hasn't completely ended, though. Mr. Shimizu is leaving the room. Well, as far as our next commission meeting is concerned, on the 9th of June, here in our meeting room, we will have a discussion about our conclusions as well as present on the evacuees survey and the results of that survey. Thank you very much for attending.
Eh メディアの方にご連絡を申し上げます。記者会見ですが。
As far as the press conference is concerned, we'd like to receive some time from you and begin at 1830 minutes. So 6:30 would be when the press conference will be held. 6:30 is when the press conference will be held here in this very same room. Thank you very much.